What happens when a conservative firebrand walks into the lion's den of late-night satire? And what happens when a host known for mockery meets a guest who refuses to play along? This wasn't just a talk show. It became a national flashpoint in under 15 minutes. The night began like any other taping of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. The marquee glowed outside the Ed Sullivan Theater, casting a soft light over the line of eager audience members. Inside, producers hustled between camera setups and teleprompters. Colbert's crew was unusually tense. There were whispers in the hallway about tonight's guest, murmurs that this wouldn't be a typical banter-filled segment. The band played a warm-up number, the crowd clapped on cue, and Colbert stood, just off stage reviewing notes, lips pursed and eyes sharp. He wasn't smiling. The energy backstage was not the usual cocktail of caffeine and comic timing. It was different. When Charlie Kirk arrived, the tension in the building shifted from electric to volatile. He walked in confidently, dressed in a crisp blazer, holding a well-worn leather notebook. His team, noticeably smaller than most celebrity entourages, followed close behind, tight-lipped and focused. According to a floor assistant, Kirk refused pre-show chit-chat with producers. He declined wardrobe tweaks, makeup touch-ups, and most notably, refused to pre-clear talking points. "I'm here to have a real conversation," he reportedly said. Colbert's staff exchanged wary glances. The last time someone said that, it ended in a PR disaster. But this wasn't Brad Pitt or J-Lo. This was Charlie Kirk, head of Turning Point USA, known for debate, not diplomacy. And from the moment he stepped into the wings, it was clear. Kirk didn't come to play by anyone else's rules. Stephen Colbert took the stage with his usual polish, but beneath the polished grin was a glint of something sharper. His monologue that night took a noticeable detour from lighthearted politics and pop culture jabs. Instead, it edged into cultural commentary, aimed squarely at those he deemed nostalgic for a time that never existed. The audience laughed, but the punchlines had bite. Between jokes about classic Americana and caricatures of 1950s values, the camera cut to the band, but even they seemed a step behind the tempo. The vibe wasn't playful, it was predatory. Backstage, Kirk watched from a monitor, arms folded. Colbert's tone wasn't lost on him. "So tonight," Colbert said, "we have a very special guest, someone who thinks Norman Rockwell was a political theorist." Laughter erupted, but the sting was intentional. It was less an introduction and more a warning. Kirk's team, posted by the studio doors, exchanged uneasy looks. They knew what was happening. Colbert was setting the stage, not just for an interview, but for an ambush. The kind of segment that goes viral for all the wrong reasons. When Kirk was finally introduced, Colbert's voice was smooth, but soaked in irony. "Please welcome a man who believes tradition is a strategy, not a memory. Charlie Kirk." The applause was enthusiastic, but not all of it felt sincere. Kirk walked on, smiled, and shook Colbert's hand firmly. But as they sat, the air thickened. Colbert leaned back, legs crossed, lips pursed in performative curiosity. Kirk, ever composed, opened his notebook and placed it on his lap. The show had only just begun, but the script had already been set, and neither man had any intention of sticking to it. The first minute of the conversation masqueraded as cordial. Colbert asked about Turning Point USA's recent campus tour, and Kirk responded with measured enthusiasm. "We've seen record attendance," he said. "Young people are hungry for truth." Colbert nodded politely, but his fingers drummed lightly on his desk. An old tell that producers knew meant he was winding up for a pivot. The laughter cues were working, but the tension was creeping in. There was no punchline yet, but the setup was building. Then it came. Colbert leaned forward, smile tightening. "So, Charlie, when you say truth, is that a synonym for nostalgia? Or just a politically convenient filter?" The audience chuckled, unsure if they were supposed to laugh or lean in. Kirk didn't flinch. "I'd call it history," he replied. "And I don't think the nuclear family, God, or national pride are punchlines." The temperature in the room dropped a degree. Colbert's eyebrows lifted. His smile flickered. It wasn't the response he was expecting, and certainly not the one he was prepared to deflect with humor. The shift was almost imperceptible, but the air snapped taut. The studio lights reflected off Kirk's notebook as he opened it slowly. "You invited me here to talk," he said. "So, let's talk." Colbert's team, watching from behind the camera, exchanged glances. This wasn't going to be a late-night puff piece. They had seen confrontations before, but something about this one felt different, colder, sharper. And as Colbert glanced at the teleprompter, then back to Kirk, it became clear. They were officially off script. Colbert tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Let's talk about values then," he said, voice syrupy. "You speak a lot about tradition, but whose tradition are we talking about? And what happens to those who don't fit into your version of America?" The crowd oohed softly, sensing the shift from satire to confrontation. Kirk smiled tightly, a practiced restraint behind his eyes. "That's a clever way to reframe it," he said. "But tradition isn't exclusion. It's a foundation: faith, family, freedom. They're not partisan ideas, they're what this country was built on." The audience's reaction was mixed. Some clapped, others sat in silence. Colbert pressed. "But you see how that sounds, right? Like a gated ideal. One where progress is the threat and the past is sacred, no matter how flawed." Kirk didn't look away. "We learn from the past. We don't erase it. Progress without roots leads to chaos." His tone was firm but not raised. His words weren't inflammatory, they were immovable. That's what made them so dangerous to the narrative Colbert was building. And then the line that tipped the balance. Colbert leaned in and said, "So, would you say segregation was part of that traditional foundation too?" The air went cold. Even the crew flinched. Kirk sat up straighter, jaw tense. "That's a disgusting mischaracterization," he said, voice still level. "You're conflating evil systems with moral principles. I won't let you do that." The audience went silent. No punchline followed, just a stare-off between two men who now fully understood this wasn't a debate. It was a detonation. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was surgical. The studio, once buzzing with pre-show glee, was now a vacuum. Colbert broke it with a chuckle, but it landed like broken glass. "Hey, just asking the tough questions," he said, but his voice lacked its usual glibness. Kirk stared straight ahead. "And I gave you a serious answer," he replied. "Too serious for laughs, I guess." The tension had moved beyond political. This was now about control. And it was clear Kirk wasn't going to give Colbert any. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, unsure whether to laugh or lean back. One woman in the second row folded her arms. A man near the aisle leaned forward, elbows on knees, as if watching a courtroom drama unfold. Colbert tapped his pen on the desk. "Let's lighten it up a bit," he muttered, before shifting to a question about Kirk's view on public schools. But Kirk didn't take the bait. "You don't get to pivot now," he said. "You tried to paint me as a bigot, and when it didn't work, you moved on." The accusation hung heavy, and even the stage manager glanced nervously at the floor producer. Backstage, a junior writer whispered to another, "He's not supposed to push back like this." Colbert was losing grip of the rhythm. This wasn't a guest rattled by satire. This was a guest who expected the attack and came armored. Kirk's voice didn't rise. He didn't match snark with outrage. He simply stayed planted, calm and unflinching. And that, more than any counterpunch, made Colbert's jokes suddenly feel hollow. The audience didn't know whether to laugh, gasp, or look away. For the first time in a long while, the king of late night didn't look amused. He looked cornered. Colbert adjusted his tie and leaned back, attempting to reassert dominance with posture alone. "Charlie, I get it. You've got convictions," he said, smirking slightly. "But don't you ever wonder if your version of America is, well, a little too black and white?" Kirk didn't blink. "Right and wrong usually are," he said, his voice crisp. "And if you're asking whether truth should be blurred to make people feel better, no. I don't think that's compassion. I think that's cowardice." Gasps fluttered across the room, followed by a slow, uneasy hush. Colbert looked to the audience for backup, as he often did when an interview veered tense. But this time, the crowd didn't rally. There was a strange stillness, like everyone had forgotten the laugh signs existed. The band, usually quick to fill dead air, stayed silent. Colbert gave a dry laugh. "So, if people don't agree with you, They're cowards? Kirk didn't miss a beat. Number. But if they know the truth and still lie about it, maybe. The studio lights suddenly felt brighter, hotter, and far less forgiving. In the control room, the director muttered, "He's not cracking." A producer hovered by the teleprompter, ready to cue a break, but Colbert waved it off. He wasn't ready to give up the segment, but the show's pace had slowed to a crawl. No rhythm, no flow. Just a philosophical staring contest between a host used to applause and a guest who didn't care for it. Charlie Kirk had stopped playing defense, and the moment he did, Colbert stopped being funny. Colbert's trademark smirk had all but vanished. What began as satire now sat naked in the harsh light of confrontation. "So, let me ask you this," he said, voice noticeably tighter. "Do you really believe America was better in the past?" Kirk folded his hands. "I believe America has moral foundations worth preserving. That's not the same as ignoring injustice. It's about protecting what works while fixing what's broken." The answer wasn't incendiary, but it was unswerving. And that, in this moment, was more threatening than a raised voice. The audience sat suspended between two worlds, expecting a laugh track but hearing a civics lecture. Colbert tried again, a note of sarcasm returning to his voice. "Right, because nothing says modern relevance like quoting the Founding Fathers." Kirk nodded. "Funny. The Constitution still governs your paycheck." There was no smile, just silence. Then a few surprised claps from the back of the room. Colbert leaned forward, eyes narrowing. This wasn't the guest he expected. This was someone who came to challenge the premise, not just the questions. Behind the scenes, staff whispered among themselves. The producers were already in damage control mode. Cue cards were being rewritten, social media interns were clipped to their phones, and one junior staffer muttered, "He's flipping the whole segment." Because Kirk wasn't playing the villain Colbert hoped for. He wasn't ranting or unraveling, he was composed, focused, and each calm answer only made the host look more rattled. It wasn't supposed to go this way, but by now it was clear. Charlie Kirk wasn't the one being interviewed anymore. He was running the room. The red on-air light dimmed as the show cut to commercial, but the tension didn't fade. It detonated. Colbert stood abruptly, heading off stage without acknowledging Kirk. In the wings, crew members scrambled with clipboards and earpieces. A makeup assistant stepped toward Kirk, but he waved her off. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't blinking. If anything, he looked like he was settling in. Meanwhile, Colbert was pacing. His voice, once cool and controlled, had turned sharp. "He's hijacking the segment," he snapped to a producer. "I'm not going to let him lecture my audience on virtue like it's Sunday school." Back at the desk, Kirk remained still, jotting a few notes in his leather notebook. The band played a disjointed tune, more out of obligation than mood. One floor assistant whispered, "Should we reset the next bit?" A senior producer shook their head. "No time, Colbert wants it back live. He thinks he can redirect." But the control booth wasn't convinced. "Redirect what?" someone muttered. "He already lost the room." It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about tone. And Colbert, usually the conductor of every segment's rhythm, had been thrown off beat since minute 5. When cameras turned back on, the applause sign lit up, half-hearted. Colbert returned to his seat with a forced smile that fooled no one. Kirk offered a polite nod. Colbert didn't return it. The desk separated them, but it may as well have been a trench. The next words out of Colbert's mouth would determine everything. Would he diffuse it? Pivot to humor? Or push the gas pedal harder and brace for impact? The answer came in the form of a smirk and a question dripping in condescension. The second half of the segment wasn't going to calm anything. It was about to erupt. Colbert leaned in, fingers steepled. "Charlie," he began, voice syrupy with implication. "Do you ever worry that preaching traditional American values is just a coded way of saying you're afraid of a world you can't control anymore?" The audience gasped, not quite laughing, not quite breathing. The question wasn't clever, it was a dagger. Kirk didn't flinch. "You're confusing conviction with fear," he said evenly. "But that's common when you mock faith and patriotism for a living." A few claps broke through the stunned silence. Others just stared. The temperature on set plummeted. Colbert blinked slowly, caught between a grin and a glare. Mock? No, Charlie. I illuminate hypocrisy. If the flag becomes a costume and faith becomes a brand, someone has to point it out. Kirk didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You confuse entertainment with insight. Just because you say it with a punchline doesn't make it true. That line hit harder than anything before. Colbert's desk was no longer a shield, it was a stage he no longer owned. Backstage, the energy had shifted from tension to dread. Producers stood frozen, headsets buzzing with overlapping voices. We've lost narrative control, someone muttered. Should we cue the emergency segment? But no one made a move. Everyone knew this was the segment. There would be no viral joke to salvage it, no edited cut to soften the impact. This was the kind of moment that breaks out of late night and barrels straight into the cultural bloodstream. And Colbert, for all his experience, was now boxed in. Kirk had planted himself unshaken, and the host's usual weapons, sarcasm, mockery, applause, had misfired. Badly. The studio crowd, once an eager chorus of laughter and cheers, now seemed divided. A slow, uncertain clap began from the upper left section after Kirk's last remark, but it didn't catch. Others exchanged glances, confused whether they were watching a comedy show or a courtroom. Colbert forced a chuckle, tapping his pen against the desk. Wow, Charlie, that sounded rehearsed, he said, the sarcasm brittle. Kirk didn't miss a beat. Truth doesn't need rehearsal, just conviction. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Colbert turned to the camera, attempting to deflect. You know, folks, he said, gesturing vaguely toward Kirk. Sometimes I invite guests to challenge me. But I didn't expect to host a sermon. A few people laughed. A few more stayed dead silent. One audience member near the front actually stood up, arms crossed, then sat down again as if unsure whether to leave or lean in. The show's usual rhythm had collapsed, and with it, the unquestioned loyalty of the studio crowd. For the first time, Colbert's charm wasn't enough. Behind the curtain, panic was starting to ripple. Social's already reacting, one assistant murmured, staring at a live feed. Half the comments say Charlie's winning. The executive producer, eyes locked on the stage monitor, muttered under his breath, "This isn't good. Stephen's losing the room." Another producer added, "It's not just the room, he's losing the narrative." And that's when it hit them. They hadn't just miscalculated the guest. They'd underestimated the audience. This wasn't going to be a controlled clash, it was going to be a rupture, and the next 10 minutes could either contain it or blow the roof off. Colbert leaned forward again, the mask of playful wit cracking. "So, let me get this straight," he said, voice sharp. "You think America's problems can be solved by going backwards? More church pews, more patriotism, fewer pronouns?" The audience winced. Some laughed nervously, others stayed stone-faced. Kirk didn't hesitate. "I think America's problems stem from forgetting who we are," he said, "and mocking faith, tradition, and identity doesn't make you brave. It makes you disconnected." The crowd murmured, caught between applause and awe. Colbert's face shifted. No more smirks. "You know what, Charlie?" he said, voice rising. "Maybe I'm tired of people coming on my show and pretending their way is the only way to be American." Kirk sat forward, his voice low but precise. "I'm not pretending, I'm reminding. You invited me here, and now you're upset that I actually said something." A loud "yes" came from a corner of the audience. It wasn't planned. It wasn't part of the show. It was real, and Colbert heard it. Backstage, the control room was chaos. "We need to cut now," someone barked. "Stephen's off script, Kirk's in control, and the crowd's not with us anymore." But the director hesitated. "If we cut now, we admit it." Every second on screen was now a gamble. The audience, once an asset, had become unpredictable. What was supposed to be a takedown had turned into a takedown in reverse. Charlie Kirk, unshaken and uninvited to laugh, had crossed a threshold most guests never dared. He wasn't trying to go viral, he was trying to win, and he was doing it. Stephen Colbert exhaled, long and slow, then stood. "You know, Charlie, maybe this was a mistake," he said, glancing toward the audience without smiling. Maybe you came here looking for a fight, not a conversation." Kirk didn't move. "No, Stephen," he replied calmly. "I came here expecting disagreement. I just didn't expect intellectual dishonesty." The crowd stirred again, louder this time. An audible wave of shock mixed with uncertain applause. Colbert turned to his team off camera and muttered, "Cut this now." The floor producer motioned urgently, but the cameras kept rolling. Security stepped just inside the curtain, awaiting the signal. Kirk finally rose to his feet, never raising his voice. "If you invite someone on your show just to attack what they believe, don't be surprised when they defend themselves," he said. His words hung heavy in the room. Even some of the crew stood still, eyes darting between host and guest. "All right," Colbert said through clenched teeth. "We're done here." The lights didn't dim. The crowd didn't cheer. The band didn't play. Kirk nodded once, tucked his notebook under his arm, and walked calmly off stage. No security needed. The sound that followed wasn't applause or laughter. It was a collective breath being held and not exhaled. The moment Kirk exited, Colbert turned to the camera and forced a brittle smile. "Well, that was certainly spirited," he said, attempting levity. But the silence from the audience made the joke land flat. A few uneasy laughs echoed, but most of the crowd remained quiet, unsure whether they had just witnessed a meltdown or a message. Colbert shuffled his cards, visibly rattled, and waved half-heartedly toward the next segment. Backstage, producers were already huddled over live social feeds. "We're getting hammered," someone whispered. "Clips are everywhere, uncut, raw, people are siding with Kirk." The damage wasn't theoretical, it was quantifiable. Within minutes, hashtags exploded online. Viewers flooded comment sections calling out Colbert for condescension and praising Kirk's composure. It wasn't just a clash, it was a referendum. Colbert retreated to his dressing room without speaking to anyone. His staff trailed behind, silent and pale. One crew member muttered, "He thought he'd dunk on him." Instead, he gave him a platform. Outside the studio, fans and critics alike were already filming their hot takes. The world hadn't waited for the official broadcast. The confrontation had gone live in real time, and it had already escaped Colbert's control. By the time the taping ended, clips of the confrontation were already trending. Within an hour, Charlie Kirk, Colbert meltdown, and traditional values flooded the algorithm. Accounts from both ends of the political spectrum weighed in. Conservative voices celebrated the moment as a rare instance where a guest refused to be mocked into silence. Liberal voices were split. Some defended Colbert's tone, while others admitted it felt like a rare misfire. The unedited audience-recorded footage told a different story than the network's polished cut. Kirk's calm demeanor, Colbert's mounting frustration, and the crowd's shifting energy couldn't be denied. TikTok edits with subtitles and reaction cuts went viral. One video hit over 2 million views in 6 hours. "This wasn't a debate," a commentator said. "This was a reversal." Colbert got caught unprepared. Major outlets rushed to publish think pieces. The Atlantic called it a collision between entertainment and conviction. Variety labeled it a late-night stumble. And by morning, Kirk had already been invited to speak on 3 rival networks. The culture war had found a new flashpoint, and Colbert, once untouchable in his domain, was now on defense. The fallout wasn't theoretical, it was measurable, and it was growing. Inside CBS headquarters, the mood was grim. Executives gathered for an emergency debrief as viewership metrics rolled in. The segment had spiked in ratings, but for the wrong reasons. "We got eyeballs," one exec said, "but we lost control." Producers defended the original segment plan, insisting the intent was satire, not sabotage, but others weren't so forgiving. "He didn't just let Kirk speak," one VP muttered, "he let him win." Meanwhile, Colbert remained uncharacteristically silent. No tweets, no clever one-liners. Just a closed door and a note to cancel his press availability for the next day. According to one staffer, he'd rewatched the segment in his office 3 times. He kept saying, "I should have cut it sooner," they recalled. But the truth is, he never expected Kirk to hold his ground. He thought he'd fold. Kirk, on the other hand, capitalized swiftly. That evening, his team posted a full breakdown on social media with timestamps and side-by-side footage comparing audience reactions to Colbert's edited version. The truth doesn't need a laugh track, the caption read. It was bold, it was direct, and it was devastating. Colbert hadn't just lost a debate, he'd inadvertently handed his guest a megaphone, and now the echo was deafening. Hollywood insiders began whispering what no one had dared say before, that Colbert had lost his edge. Writers from competing shows took notice, some quietly gloating, others concerned. This wasn't just a bad night, one former showrunner remarked. It exposed a vulnerability. He brought a knife to a chess match. Colbert's colleagues at other networks scrambled to reassess how they'd handle similarly polarizing guests. The old playbook, mock, control, edit, no longer guaranteed victory. PR consultants warned late-night teams, the audience is changing. They want conviction, not just cleverness. The shockwaves rippled through executive circles. Bookers hesitated to invite other conservative figures, worried they might replicate Kirk's performance. One segment producer confessed, "We don't want another moment where the host looks smug and the guest looks sane. It's a bad look, and it lives forever online." Meanwhile, Kirk's inbox was flooded with interview requests. Podcasters, news anchors, influencers, everyone wanted the man who had dismantled Colbert's formula live on his own stage. It wasn't just a win for Kirk. It was a shift in the rules of engagement. The game had changed, and everyone in late-night television knew it. Some were recalibrating, others were panicking, but no one was pretending it hadn't happened. When the official episode aired later that night, viewers immediately noticed the cuts. Key moments were trimmed, transitions softened, and Colbert's final words spliced to sound more composed. But by then, the raw footage had already dominated the internet. Commentators were quick to call out the edits. "They're trying to rewrite a moment we all watched happen," one viral post read. "It's not just spin, it's censorship." The hashtag #Colbert cut trended for hours. Clips comparing the raw and aired versions gained millions of views. Side-by-side reactions showed how laughter was added, how Kirk's sharper statements were muted or omitted entirely. Viewers weren't fooled. "It's insulting," said one popular YouTube analyst. "They still think we're passive consumers. We're not. We're witnesses now." The network had tried to soften the blow, but ended up igniting more anger. The next morning, legacy outlets tried damage control with polite headlines. "Tense exchange on late night. Colbert faces pushback." But online, the verdict was harsher. He got wrecked. Outclassed on his own turf. Kirk walked in and walked out untouchable. For the first time in years, Colbert wasn't the one telling the story. The audience was. And their version didn't need editing. In the weeks that followed, the fallout continued. Kirk used the momentum to launch a speaking series titled Uncancelled, drawing record crowds at campuses and civic centers across the country. Each event opened with a montage of the Colbert segment. Unedited, unfiltered, unforgotten. Meanwhile, Colbert's show faced a subtle but undeniable decline in viewership. Sponsors didn't flee, but they watched closely. Studio executives remained silent in public, but restless in meetings. Colbert returned to his desk each night, but something had changed. The smugness was quieter, the monologues a touch more defensive. He tried to move past it with jokes, but the viral ghost of that moment hovered. Guests noticed, audiences sensed it. And behind the scenes, producers tightened protocols for controversial bookings. No one wanted another Kirk incident. But avoiding confrontation meant avoiding authenticity. And audiences were starting to notice that too. So, what do you think? Was Charlie Kirk justified? Or did Stephen Colbert just ask the wrong question? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and tell me who you want covered next. Because one thing's for sure, truth doesn't play by the script and live television doesn't come with a safety net.